Hello guys, welcome back to the OPD podcast with Joe and Austin. It's no longer just me and Austin. We have a special guest this week, somebody that I have a great deal of respect for, somebody whose work I greatly appreciate and have followed for quite a long time, somebody that I find very much is in line with what me and Austin have been trying to bring you guys over the few years that we've been doing this podcast. So it's an absolute pleasure today to have Victor Black on the podcast. So Victor, maybe if you could just introduce yourself, what you do, what kind of content you put out, and then we can introduce the topic.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you, Austin. I appreciate the opportunity to come onto the show and talk with you guys and obviously reach out to your listeners as well. I think probably the best way for me to explain to people who I am is probably to start with who I'm not, because quite honestly, most people that hear this are going to go, who? Never heard of this guy, right? And I think that's a very fair and very valid position. So let me just start off by basically explaining, I have almost no profile, like I would even say zero profile in what I call professional bodybuilding coaches. So there's a reason for that, and that's principally because I don't see myself as a bodybuilding coach. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, sure, I'm a competitive amateur bodybuilder, and I compete in the over 50 masters class, and sure, I've got bodybuilders as clients, so I do coach bodybuilders. Some of the people that I coach, for example, you probably know, Joe, a guy called Paul Rowe. He's based in the UK.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, he's isn't he a masters competitor?
Yeah, he's won the over 50s British Championships, and he's a world class.
Yeah, I think actually I saw him compete at the UK BFF, if I'm not mistaken.
When you look at the standard that he competes at in the over 50s class, he's phenomenal. Right? But I think it's probably fair to say that most people listening to this, especially in the UK, in the US rather, would go, who? Paul who? You know? So I don't have a profile, pursuing or coaching what I call professional bodybuilders. So who I typically coach really is me, a guy like me. So we're amateurs, and more than anything, we're interested in balancing outcomes and longevity, like looking at the safer use of enhancement products, but with always an eye on health. And that's somewhat problematic in the professional, bodybuilding world, because quite bluntly, most aspiring professional bodybuilders aren't even remotely interested in my message, what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I would even go so far as to say of many of them, they probably fall under this banner of, you've probably heard of like what's called the Godwin Dilemma. Do you know what the Godwin Dilemma is?
No.
Okay. So a few years ago, they did some surveys of elite level athletes and basically proposed the question to them, if we gave you a PD and you won the gold medal at the Olympics, but you died of a heart attack 5 years later, would you take it? This is the Godwin Dilemma.
Yeah.
Right.
And the original answer was just over 50% of guys said, yeah, I'd take the drug, right? And relatively recently, like 2014, 2016 timeframes, they revisited that dilemma. They revisited this. They restudied this question, and what they found out was it's probably a little bit exaggerated, but there are certain individuals within elite athletics that are more likely to take high risk than others. So, for example, elite level cyclists, and they're fairly notorious for high level PED use, are more likely to take high risk than someone, say, in the archery team, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I guess where I'm going with this, I'm sure you would appreciate that, bodybuilders tend to take what I call high risk strategies towards enhancement. And they're not, therefore, really that interested in what I have to say, which is all about safer use over outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah? So this is why a lot of people go, who? Because a lot of people are going to hear what I have to say, are going to go, so you're telling me to take less. And I have to be honest with you, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm trying to make the point that you can realize your goals with less, and you should be taking the smallest amount of risk that you need to take to realize your goals. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether that makes sense in terms of explaining who I am, but hopefully some people can say, okay, so this is a new voice that we haven't heard before, and this is where he's coming from. He's more about harm prevention balanced to get outcomes than some guy that's trained 15 IFBB Pro card holders. Okay. So what we were going to basically talk about today was a little bit about trying to explain to individuals that the sad reality is that what most people think they know about performance enhancing drug use is quite bluntly not factual. There's just so much misunderstanding and misinformation, and you can use whatever language, bro science, whatever you want. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is what most people think they know about PEDs and steroid use and performance enhancement is either flawed or flat out wrong. And this is one of my great crusades about trying to get people to understand that the quality of the information that's available to athletes today about what we're taking and how it affects us on a physiological basis is just not factual. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, Joe and I talk sometimes before the show, sometimes during the show, and even now, I would say in the last couple years or so, there's been some more people emerging that have quality information, but still the things that we see that I don't know, I don't want to call it old school, methodology or thought process, but some of the information that we see out there is so old and dated and just wrong, and people still prescribe it. And it,
correct.
Yeah, and it just continues. It's like some things never die. It just, and it's no fault, and I don't think it's necessarily a fault of the consumer. Yeah, they need to educate themselves too, but they're also, at the same time, like they're also looking at individuals that they view as a professional, so they're taking their advice, right? I mean, it's like coaching. You get a client that had poor advice from their previous coach, but do you fault that person for following the advice? Maybe not.
I completely agree. In fact, I would go one step further than that and say I fault the information providers,
right,
in inverted brackets, rather than the consumers of the information themselves, because they are consuming information and then equating that to knowledge, and how are they to know that what appears to be very credible, well-researched, evidence-based information is just horribly outdated.
Well, not only that, but it's obviously, like the way that someone portrays themselves. If you have a coach or someone that's putting out information and they scream it loud enough and they're confident enough, people are going to believe it, whether it's wrong. It could be dead wrong. Like, I've seen stuff that's just so completely dead wrong, like from a mechanistic standpoint in terms of how things work. It literally is just completely irrational, but yet people will believe it because they sensationalize it.
Correct. So I guess there's also then that leads to the point of like, so I'm the first person to admit that there's some things that you could say, well, that's a discussion about what is technically true and what's technically not. But at the end of the day, when you take that technically correct or technically position and then apply it in the real world, it doesn't create a differential in outcomes. I see that as nothing more than trivia busting. I'm interested in the information that we have, that we are misinformed about, that has the potential to significantly improve or provide detriment to your health, or significantly improve outcomes. It needs to have a consequence in its application. Otherwise, to me, it's simply, two guys arguing about trivia, what is and is not technically correct. And quite bluntly, I have little interest in that.
Yeah, and I think also on the flip side of like what is more worrying is, and what sort of gave me an affinity to bring you on the podcast, Victor, was that I know that you introduce yourself with the guys that your content is more for the individual that's looking at longevity and positive health outcomes. And I think a lot of people listening to this at that point going, they're not really interested in this.
Yeah.
Because, and fair enough, I understand these people. and the majority of my clients are people that come to me with extreme goals. But what you people need to realize is, and again, what gave me an affinity to bring Victor on to the podcast was that our models of use are actually, they're the same, because we're still working under a safer use model. And that's, I think, what needs to be understood, is that the models of use are going to be the same. Maybe the desired outcome might be slightly different in the sense that you may push a little bit harder, but what I was going to say there, sorry, I don't want to ramble, is that yes, a lot of information is outdated, but what's unfortunately happening now with the social media era and people becoming these biochemistry gurus, so to speak, is that they are literally making things up to gain clients, sell stuff. A very simple example that people will have seen recently, DMP increases androgen receptor density. That might be true, but when asked for the reference, you can find it if you buy my DMP book, So again, with just objective truth is the reason why I'm bringing someone like Victor on here for you guys.
Yeah. And two, I think something that Joe and I have tried to get through to people is also learning how to balance all the variables in conjunction to get the best outcome without necessarily doing more of one thing or another. So learning how to use things together and synergy and what have you. And that also that there's very much a point of diminishing returns, right? I mean, I run into this all the time. I actually did a video the other day. I haven't put it up yet, but I did a video. I was going over lab work for an individual. They presented me with their lab work, and they wanted me to use it as an example of what not to do. And this is a person that I've seen it firsthand. More use equaled worsening physique. And you see that especially when you get that in your mind that more is better, and at a point just more systemically stressful, and you just look worse.
Correct. 100%. 100%. I think most people agree that there is a point where as you escalate the dose and you escalate the risk, there's an escalated return. Almost every dose response study that's ever been done on any anabolic product or SARMs shows that to be true. But there's also a point where you reach a balance between, therapeutic effective outcome and toxicity, and the two have to be balanced. And I think most people agree with that. I think what most people might disagree on, or there might be divergence on it. So where exactly does that threshold lie? That's probably the point. Maybe I could pull on a little thread here, and we can just kind of go down a path and see where it takes us. Because I wanted to try and put something on the table that people that haven't heard this argument before can be challenged enough by to go, oh, I didn't know that. Like, wow, what I thought was true is clearly not true. And then hoping the outcome from that is asking themselves the question, well, if that's true, what else don't I know? Right? So maybe if I start off by saying, really since testosterone was synthesized back in 1930s, researchers have been trying to make modifications or derivatives of testosterone that effectively realize the therapeutic benefits of testosterone without the androgenic impact, so that these compounds could be deployed in what we would refer to as the androgen sensitive, women, children, the elderly. Yeah. And that's really what has driven the development of all of these compounds that have a skewed anabolic to androgenic ratio. So most people are familiar with the concept that there's a anabolic to androgenic ratio that we attach to anabolic steroids. That basically comes from something called a Hirschberger bioassay. And again, most people are probably familiar with that. Just those that don't, it's probably best described as a short-term screening test that we use, tissues from the male reproductive tract of rats, where we administer androgens to the rats, and then we basically kill them. We weigh the the tissues from the reproductive tract, and as a consequence of that process, we allocate a androgenic to anabolic ratio to that compound. Most people are familiar with that compound, that concept. Yeah. What most people are not familiar with is that the reason that we do that is there's a process involved in the evaluation of these types of compounds. Usually, it starts with what would broadly be described as a receptor binding study. That then moves to some variant of a bioassay. But ultimately, you have to take those compounds and place them into human application. Yeah. And the great irony here, of course, is everybody can quote off the top of their head these anabolic to androgenic ratios of various compounds, but what they don't realize is that there's literally zero evidence that those ratios carry across into human use. I mean, zero evidence. So it's pretty easy to explain, because anybody who's been around for a little while would know that typically they would, allocate a anabolic to androgenic ratio of something like Anavar as being, 3 times more anabolic than testosterone. Everybody's heard this, yeah. But in reality, I don't think there's a single individual out there that's saying, look, if you took 2 guys who were, for all intents purposes, undergoing the same behaviors in every other regard, you gave one of them 300 milligrams of testosterone a week, and you gave the other one 300 milligrams of Anavar a week, that the guy taking the Anavar is going to get 3 times the tissue growth. You know, I don't know anyone that believes that to be true. Okay. But ironically, people still use this androgenic to anabolic or myotropic ratio as one of the primary factors in consideration of what drugs that they're going to use and when. It's still very much front of mind for them. This drug has an anabolic ratio, an androgenic ratio, and such. But again, repeating myself, there is absolutely zero evidence that those numbers are true in human application. Yeah. So maybe I can give people a practical example, and again, when people hear this, very often they think, "Oh, I didn't know that." Most people are familiar with the drug drostanolone. It's commonly referred to as Masteron, and most people are probably familiar with its clinical use in the 60s in the use of estrogen-mediated female breast cancer. That's where the name Masteron came from, the Latin word mas, it means breast. But what a lot of people don't know is that before drostanolone was in common use, the reference standard drug for the treatment of that disease was testosterone propionate. They used to give women testosterone propionate. Unfortunately, they found that although it was very effective at treating the disease, it also had the undesirable outcome of virilization, masculinization effects. And so researchers set about looking at different compounds to replace testosterone in that application. And ultimately, they looked at a number of different drugs, including drostanolone and ultimately settled on drostanolone. But in that process, what they basically went to was they said, okay, so we're going to take drostanolone, testosterone, and nandrolone, and between the years 1968 and I think about 1972, they did a whole bunch of trials where they looked at what's the efficacy of this product, what's the safety of this product, and what's the virilization outcomes. And what they found actually was that nandrolone was equally as effective as testosterone in this setting, but unfortunately, it caused more masculinization effects than drostanolone. So it was marginally more effective, but it created greater virilization outcome. And so ultimately, drostanolone was chosen as the reference drug for the treatment of that disease and given the name Masteron and taken to market. But the point of this whole exercise was that at that time, because these drugs were being applied to estrogen-mediated breast cancer, they were considered to be anti-estrogenic drugs, if that makes sense. Yeah. But anybody that knows these drugs would say, look, if you took 300 milligrams of testosterone and applied to a male, you would not call that an anti-estrogenic drug. Testosterone is not considered anti-estrogenic, but at the time it was labeled that, and so was nandrolone. and so was drostanolone. And that's why people today say that masteron has an anti-estrogenic effect. It doesn't, nor does testosterone, nor the nandrolone. It's a naming convention that's a hangover from the 70s. There is absolutely no evidence that masteron is anti-estrogenic. Yes, there is evidence that said it can inhibit prolactin. It's a prolactin modulator, but the whole, the mythology behind drostanolone being an anti-estrogen is premised on the fact that testosterone is an anti-estrogen, nandrolone is an anti-estrogen, and masteron is an anti-estrogen in the framework of its application against estrogen-mediated breast cancer. Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
So if you spoke to the average guy, he would basically say to you, masteron is an anti-estrogen. And yes, that's true in that context. But it's not for me. It doesn't lower my estrogen levels.
Mm-hmm.
It allows me to modulate estrogen-related side effects because I can use it to elevate androgen to estrogenic ratios. But there's no evidence, no one's ever been able to show me a study that actually physically lowers estrogen levels in men.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the point of this is, as you go through all of these drugs, a lot of the things that people think they know about these compounds, people select drugs on anabolic to estrogenic ratios. People select drugs on, that's an anti-estrogen. People select drugs on, it's 5 times more anabolic or 5 times more androgenic than such and such a compound. But many of these things, when you actually go looking in the evidence, there's no evidence to support it. It's a misunderstanding, or it's just a lack of evidence. It's an assumption on our part because we carried this drug over from use in women to off-label use in men, and we just assumed because it was being used, as an anti-estrogen, that it must be an anti-estrogen, but it's not really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've spoken about that quite a bit on here in terms of modulation of androgenic to estrogenic action at the site, etc., driving estrogenic side effects, and that's why these drugs, these androgens, were traditionally used. And yeah, that is funny that you bring that up, because it is something that you would put pretty far down the list of things that people would still believe, especially with like the amount of people that have a proclivity for keeping their blood work.
Yeah, I guess where I'm going with this is I'm kind of like trying to lead us into a story here. So the next piece of the puzzle, I guess, unlocks the whole, I see what you're saying here, right? So maybe I could just explain what that is, and then people go, they'll have an aha moment. Most people today still believe that trenbolone, rather, is a drug that has a profile that is 5 times more androgenic and 5 times more anabolic than testosterone. That is so prevalent today that almost every reference site in the world states that. Even Bill Llewellyn's book states that, right? But the reality is that information came from, really like in the 1960s, there was a book that was betas, androgens, and anabolic agents, and there was like a passage in there that showed that. But the reality is that since 2011, 2014, 2016, we've had multiple Hirschberger assays done on trenbolone, and trenbolone is nowhere near as anabolic as testosterone, and it's nowhere near as androgenic as testosterone. A lot of people will instantly get their hackles up and they go, well, that can't be true, that can't be true. But when you think about it, just rationally and logically, when trenbolone was in human clinical use, under the banner of parabolan, who was it administered to? It was administered to women.
Yeah.
So logically and rationally, forget the evidence, put it aside, but why would you consider giving an anabolic compound, an androgenic steroid, to women that was 5 times more androgenic than testosterone? What logical, rational thought process can connect those two dots? The only reason it would make sense is because it is effectively a steroidal SARM. It is less androgenic and significantly so than testosterone. Otherwise, you would choose one of the other compounds that we have, masteron, primobolan, anavar, that we know to be androgen sensitive friendly, as it were, because the indications for use of trenbolone were things like osteoporosis, right? and muscle wasting from cancer and malnutrition. So this was a drug that was basically given to individuals who were androgen sensitive, and it just doesn't make any logical, rational sense just on that statement alone that it could possibly be significantly more androgenic than testosterone. Why would they have done that? You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's the one that makes people jump when, I'm sure, Austin, you get asked, it's a lot like, what do you think about SARMs? And generally part of my model is that we'd only ever use drugs that have undergone like as high possible degrees of human clinical testing as possible. And, often when you say to someone, well, the only SARM that has undergone human clinical testing that interests me much is Trenbolone. You're like, what? This seems crazy.
So can I disagree with that a little bit?
I'm not going to say approved for human use. No, I don't want to twist words, but at least it is studied to some degree. And once.
No, I don't mean that. What I meant by that was the definition of a SARM is a compound that is effectively tissue selective. Okay, so all of the anabolic steroids. Sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
So the definition of a SARM is basically a compound that's tissue selective. So in other words, it has equal to a greater anabolic potential than testosterone, but a significantly lower androgenic potential. So all of the anabolic steroids that we consider to be female friendly, Anadrol, Anavar, Winstrol, Nandrolone, all of Primobolan, Masteron, all of these are technically tissue sensitive products. So they're selective, in their function. So really what there are non-steroidal SARMs, what people refer to as things like Ostarine and LGD, these types of drugs. And then there are steroidal SARMs, And I definitely consider Trenbolone to be a drug that has been in human clinical use long enough, that if there were really significant consequence to its use, it would have been documented better than it has been. You have to remember this drug was in human clinical use for really decades under doctor's supervision, and we would expect to see, evidence supporting its adverse effects if they were significant. Right? So I guess the point I was making is as you go through most people's understanding of what they think they know about compounds, you have to go, well, I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm not sure I agree with that. And one of the classic things that people don't seem to understand is that Trenbolone is plausibly, I'm saying it is, but it's plausibly better for you than testosterone is, in terms of the fact that it has a much lower androgenic impact. It has a somewhat similar anabolic outcome. Clearly, we have some questions. Anyone that's familiar with the literature, there have been questions raised over cognitive function and the potential threat that Trenbolone offers to people. And I'm sure you've read the rodent studies that look at that. I mean, but the reality is that we also have studies that more numerous in number that question the neurotoxicity of Dianabol. We have studies that question the neurotoxicity of Nandrolone. I just today posted on my Facebook a study that was done in 2019 that effectively compared testosterone and Trenbolone and Stanozol and Nandrolone together, and basically Nandrolone was considered to be, based on the parameters of that study, was the most toxic on the human brain. Nandrolone, not Trenbolone, Nandrolone. Right?
Well, I think Joe and I have talked about this too. But that's kind of like a short-term versus long-term outcome, because I think people get that slight aggression or maybe some change in mood from Trenbolone, but it goes away, once they discontinue it, versus Nandrolone seemingly showing some potential long-term side effect, from use. So
I completely agree. I would personally, and obviously then we start to fall from what can we say with confidence? And that confidence comes from the evidence that we have to support our statements to opinion. Right? It is my opinion that the reason that Trenbolone does certain things. So, for example, we all know that if you take Trenbolone, you go to bed and sweat. Most guys go, I don't know why it happens, but it does. My hypothesis is that because Trenbolone is capable of acting on it's a progestin, it's capable of acting on the progesterone receptor, then it has the potential to activate brown adipose tissue and raise metabolic rate. And so it is effectively a chemical uncoupler, and that's why you sweat. Right? It's my hypothesis that it's that same action. It's the action of the progestin on the brain that causes these emotional effects, not the fact that it's such a powerful androgen. It's what you would call off androgen receptor activity that causes many of the side effects of Trenbolone that people are concerned with. Why do we sweat? It's not because it's an androgen, it's because it's also a progestin. I mean, why do we do this? Why do we do that? I think, the challenge with obviously those conversations is you start to fall away from what you say with a high degree of confidence. You start to fall into saying, what do we think we know? What is my opinion? But I guess what we can say with a high degree of confidence is that there are literally over a dozen studies on Trenbolone available today that have been done realistically in the last 20 years, pretty much unequivocally support the idea that it's ludicrous to say that Trenbolone is more androgenic than testosterone. And that's supported by the anecdote of why the hell would they use it in women if that was true?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear there when deciphering steroidal versus non-steroidal sounds. Apologies. Absolutely agreed there.
So let's see. So let's move away from the SARM subject a little bit. One of the other, and we'll get your opinion on this, Victor, because this was kind of what we were talking about before the show started. I made the estrogen joke that I had that I had given you guys that was pretty comical. Joe and I have been on the crusade of estrogen, saving the estrogen, why it's not the enemy, the overuse of AIs and what have you. Is this something, I've seen some of your writings and stuff, but I don't follow them too closely. What is your take on the current state of this?
I would go so far as to say is I'm potentially a supporter of the use of using estrogen as a PED. That's very controversial. I know that a lot of people are going to kind of shake their heads at that.
Well, let's go down that line because we've literally done podcasts on the anabolic and lipolytic benefits of estrogen. We've done podcasts on how estrogen drives the GH-IGF axes. So definitely to hear your opinion.
Talked about it.
Okay, so just I'll lead off to say, if you look at the very old school bro approach to anabolic androgenic steroids, almost everybody talks about what we would call the classical genomic pathway. In other words, you have a ligand that binds with the androgen receptor and causes gene transcription. And that's true, but it's also a very simplistic overview of how things truly work. In reality, there is, androgen receptors inside the cell, there's androgen receptors on the membrane of the cell, there's the potential for these compounds to bind with other receptors. That's what I was alluding to with Trenbolone being able to bind with progesterone receptors. The reality is that there's even evidence that estrogen binding with the estrogen receptor is a anabolic process just in and as of itself. Right? So I just think there's overwhelming evidence to support the fact that you should really not use aromatase inhibitors at all. And in my opinion, there's even an argument to be made based on really, what does your protocol look like to potentially even add estrogen into that stack? Obviously, that's, as I said, that's going to be individual by individual, protocol by protocol, but I certainly wouldn't take it off the table. It really just comes down to understanding an individual. Every individual is genetically unique. There's, even with the dose response, there's always going to be an intra-individual genetic response to compounds. And I think that the use of exogenous insulin as a performance enhancing compound is a very valid and very real and very practical discussion to have.
So
can I pull back 1 second, because I know a lot of people are listening to this and thinking, use estrogen as a PED. This is what I've been hearing.
I know.
I've been hearing about using like ethinyl estradiol or whatever these guys recommend. Can we clarify what you mean by using estrogen as a PED?
So I think there's what we have available to us today, and then there's what's coming down in the pipe, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'm personally more interested in different drugs that are coming down the pipe, potentially going to be used in female hormone replacement therapy, because there is a perception, whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant for this conversation, but there is a perception that using estrogen in female HRT carries with it the risk of cancer. Most people are familiar with the argument, and so consequential to that, clearly researchers are looking at, okay, so are there compounds that we can use that effectively bind with the estrogen receptor and give us the benefits of estrogen without the negative implications? Right? I'm interested in what those compounds are going to be and how they work, because I think that they will be more widely accepted by the community than estrogen, because I think there's just a stigma attached to estrogen that's going to be hard to break through. I think there's individuals that you can have personal relationships with and you can influence because you know them one-on-one, but in terms of being a provider of information, that's what I said before, I blame the information providers, not the consumers. Being a provider of information, I think it's going to be a hell of a lot easier once we start to have some data on the application of those compounds in our tribe. Now, what those are, it's very premature. Clearly, you have to look at the research in terms of women's hormone replacement therapy to understand what they are and how they function. I think it's too early to be saying so many milligrams of this product is the way that we do this. But I think that that's going to be part of the future of performance enhancing drugs, actually using the estrogen receptor as a anabolic pathway. If that makes sense.
So
Sorry,
go ahead. No, I was going to say, to back up a minute, and you mentioned this, you kind of grazed over it, but you mentioned in the context of someone's stack design.
Correct.
Right? And because I want to make that clear too, because that's essentially what Joe and I talked about when we talked about androgenic to estrogenic ratios is stack design. That's what we're alluding to is how it's designed, the amount of androgens in reference to the amount of estrogens. And so obviously I think that's important to state, so people aren't just driving estrogen up as the only as that's their determining factor, is just get estrogen higher. Right.
Yeah, I agree.
So obviously there has to be some context there as to how the rest of your stack design would be. And even then it goes even a step further in that I know when people ask questions about this, like on our Q&As, for example, it's hard to say this is the dose of, anabolic, and this is the dose of aromatizing compound, or this is the dose of this, because it is individual.
Correct.
It's something that takes a little bit of trial and error. It's something that if you're working with a coach, that's going to have to be observed, and you're going to have to go by. It's a biofeedback thing too, because it's not something we can even just test on lab work to give a perfect ratio. We can't just go in and test estradiol and testosterone levels or whatever on your labs and say, well, yeah, that's the ratio, because that's just not how it works.
It's usually complicated. Maybe I can explain the way that I like to approach things, and that might make things a little clearer. So I have a methodology that I like to approach cycle design for guys, and it basically follows this. I believe that you should start off by taking as much testosterone that you as a genetically unique individual can tolerate without experiencing estrogenic or DHT related side effects. So how do we arrive at that position? Basically what we'll say is, okay, so 2 milligrams per kilogram body weight is considered to be a clinical therapeutic dose of testosterone. So if you were an 80 kilogram male, that would be 160 milligrams of testosterone. We start there. And then slowly over time, we titrate the dose up until we reach the point whereby either through blood work or through biofeedback, we can get a sense of saying, okay, so that's about my threshold. So for most men, in my experience, just working with people, most guys are capable of taking on somewhere between 200 and 400 milligrams of testosterone a week without the need to use a DHT or an estrogen blocker. Now, that's a big variation, 200 to 400. There are very sensitive individuals out there. There are guys that have greater tolerances, and there's always the outlier. That one guy that could do this, right? And this is the problem. So once we reach that threshold, what I like to do is start adding in drugs that don't add to that problem. So in other words, would we choose Dianabol at that point? No, it doesn't make any sense to. Why? Because Dianabol brings with it more estrogen and more DHT, right? So we would choose a drug that, ideally was from the DHT derivative stack and start putting that in, and hopefully then, raise our androgenic, to estrogenic ratio to the point whereby potentially we might be able to even raise our testosterone one more notch up, because as you bring up the androgens, you can then at some point consequentially raise up the aromatizing compounds as well, like kind of walk them up in parallel to each other. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, when you go, well, where does the application of estrogens as a exogenous PED fit in? Mostly it fits into people that are interested in, non-steroidal SARMs and the use of compounds that don't aromatize into estrogen. There's a lot of people out there that are, interested in the use of, nandrolone as a base or SARMs as a base. Now, I'm empathetic to that because I do believe that the long-term future of performance-enhancing drugs will involve non-steroidal SARMs, but they are not the drugs we have available today. They're simply not tissue selective enough, and they're not powerful enough. But I do believe that we will see in the next 20 years compounds that fit the description of being plausibly suitable for use as a PD. But then we have to say, well, where are we going to get our estrogen from? And I think we'll see again secondary compounds. You could even call them SERMs if you want. And I don't like using that term principally because people then equate to tamoxifen or something like that and go, it's not that. It's they're going to be next generation SERMs, that don't bring with them the problems of the current generation of SERMs. So for me, I will always basically run a testosterone base, and I will always titrate my dose up to my the level that I can tolerate without the need for an AI and without the need for DHT. For me, that's about 300 milligrams of testosterone a week, and then I'll bring in some Masteron or some Proviron. The consequence of bringing in the Masteron Proviron means I can slip my testosterone up to about 400, and then I start building a stack around that. But as I said, the guy to my left and the guy to my right, he might not wish to follow that path, or he might be someone that doesn't tolerate that model well and needs to look at something else. And that's where I would say these discussions make sense. For most people, most of the time, I don't think it's necessary, if that makes sense. But there are always going to be individuals where you go, yeah, that's a valid discussion.
Yeah. I mean, that's more or less what Joe and I don't want to prescribe, suggest, I guess, right? Is that methodology. It just takes time. It takes time to learn it. Like you said, you just kind of titrate up and figure it out as you go.
Yeah. For clarity, I'm not adverse to the use of exogenous estrogen, and I can see it certainly having merit, just like you say, Victor. My issue is the application at the minute, in the way that people consult with me that are doing this already. They do it in a way like, I wanted to keep my estrogen within the low normal range so that I don't gain body fat, and I didn't want to have any DHT because I want to keep my hair, so I'm using exogenous estrogen with Osterine or with Anavar. And for me, that's poor application. We need some DHT. We need,
I guess there's two key takeaways, or two key points there. So firstly is what people need to understand is that estrogen is not the enemy, nor is DHT. I will 100% agree that DHT is not, it's not a big player in the world of hypertrophic outcomes. 100% agree. But it does matter in the bedroom, and it does matter in your brain. You only have to look at the information that we have on DHT blockers and the consequence of using them. There are enough people out there that have sexual dysfunction issues, and there are enough people out there that have cognitive function issues with the application of that drug to say, you don't want to have no DHT. And the other thing I would point out is that there's very good evidence to say that those, there's a thing called an inverted J curve. I know what you guys know what it means, but I'll just explain it for the people listening. There is really across the endocrine system, there's this thing called an inverted J curve, which at the most simplistic level basically means there's such a thing as too little of a hormone, and such a thing as too much. So it causes it forms like a U curve, where in the middle at the sweet spot, you go, I want to have that much. I don't want to have too much, and I don't want to have too little. And that applies to every single endocrine hormone there is, including DHT. So I try to lead guys from that discussion saying, DHT is not the enemy, guys. Yeah. But the second application of that would be this idea that what those guys are effectively doing is what the guys did in the 70s with terms of anabolics. They didn't have a fucking clue what was going to happen, right? They just took shit. Right now, that's a model, but I see that as high risk. I don't see that any different than using something like YK11, right? We don't even have a fucking rodent study. There's nothing to support YK11 in animal models of human use. Now, if you want to be the guy that uses that, that's really the same thing as what they're doing with estrogen today. There's no, clear line of thought based on evidence or rationale. It's suck it and see, if that makes sense. Right? And if they want to do it, plenty of guys doing that. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
I have seen that. I have actually seen that trend in the use of, since it's kind of coming into play, the use of exogenous estrogen, and how people are applying it. And they're doing it kind of like Joe said, using non-aromatizing compounds, and then basically replacing estrogen with the exogenous estrogen use. And then it, like, as you alluded to, Victor, it completely deletes the whole DHT component, because you have no testosterone converting, like via 5-alpha reductase, right? So you have none of that.
Correct.
And you're also not taking in any DHT compound. So now they're dealing with mood issues, and they're dealing with libido issues, right? Yeah, their hair's not, they're not losing their hair, but they feel like shit, and their mood's terrible. Well, they still are.
Here's my take on all this. And I know this is overly simplistic, but sometimes you just have to go, you know what, like that just makes sense. I think, and this is what I was alluding to before we took the call, Joe, and that is, in the evidence-based community especially, today, you find very bright individuals having, very detailed conversations about things that, like, I go, why are you even bothering with that? Like, it seems like you're overthinking everything, and you're making everything far more complicated than it needs to be. Exactly why do you need research chemicals? Exactly why do you need SARMs? I'm not saying I'm opposed to them, but what I'm saying is, when you look at a drug like Anavar, for example, this is a drug that we have fabulous human use clinical data on. We have good toxicity testing. We have, hundreds of human clinical trials we can look at and talk about, what's the predicted adverse events and things like that. What exactly are you chasing? Are you chasing outcomes? Are you chasing minutia and trivia, as a form of almost like mental masturbation? You get lost down the fucking rabbit hole where you've got to make everything far more complicated than it is. As I said, if you look at the average individual, I'm not talking about guys that aspire to be on the Olympia stage. That's not my audience. I'm saying the average guy who's interested in enhancement practices. I would say you have to explain to me what is wrong with a baseline level of testosterone titrated to what you can tolerate as a genetically unique individual, and then complementing that with something like Masteron or Primobolan or Anavar on rotation, just rotating through them over time blocks. Like, why do you even need to use SARMs? Like, why is it even on the table? Honestly, in my opinion, the reason it's on the table is because you have fallen for the bullshit, the marketing of the SARM sellers, that you get steroid-like outcomes at a higher safety profile. And that's, again, it's just not supported in the evidence. If you look at the safety profile of something like Anavar and low-dose testosterone, those two things together, you'd have to say, okay, so realistically, we're going to see some HDL suppression, and that's about it. Anavar as a drug is extremely well tolerated. It's even been trialed in premature babies, for Christ's sake. As a 100-kilogram man, you have nothing to fear from Anavar. Now, if you're a woman, or if you're in an androgen-sensitive cohort, I'm far more empathetic to that. But that's almost like a separate discussion, because there's a valid and viable reason for the pursuit of the discussion, rather than these guys have these conversations about. I'm not sure why you're even going down that path. What is wrong with low-level testosterone and a little bit of primobolan?
Yeah. Well, what's funny is you're right. It started off as a marketing thing, right? First, it was because these compounds are selective. They're void of side effects, right? But the problem was, I've seen numerous sets of blood work that these SARMs do suppress HPTA access. They do suppress your testosterone. They do skew your lipid profile normally. And they just do it to a lesser extent, but they're also weaker. So what's the point, right? It's just like...
Well, I don't expect you to follow my page, but just this week, literally this week, I posted the very first study that's been published on SARMs that shows liver damage consequential to the application of LGD-4033 in an individual. First case study that's been published. It just came out this month. And when you look at these guys' liver markers, it's like, get the fuck out of here. That's bad.
Right.
and the reason behind it, quite bluntly, is this. I don't have anything opposed to LGD-4033, but the truth is that the data that we have on that product is really at 1 milligram per day. Now,
right. It's very low.
It's very low, and it seems to be very well tolerated at 1 milligram a day. Now, these people don't understand two things. One is that 10 milligrams a day is not 1 milligram a day. And what is also true of all SARMs is that as you raise the dose, you lose the tissue selectivity of these compounds. Yeah?
Yeah.
So when you look at something like LGD-4033 and you say, right, I'm taking 10 times the clinical dose, that is no different than this, saying, look, we have good evidence to support a dosage of 20 milligrams of Anavar per day. It's well tolerated. There's a good safety profile from it. We know the adverse effects. We're going to see this, and this. Because 20 milligrams per day is safe, I will take 200.
Yeah. And who's doing that?
Well, and again, kind of back to my point is that, yeah, if you take 1 milligram per day, you're also not going to notice anything. So like,
see anything.
So where is the advantage? There isn't.
Correct.
I mean, like,
Correct.
Yeah, it's a great safety profile, but it doesn't, it's not serving any purpose. And now, now I've even seen, again, this was on one of those groups that someone, added me to. Thank you. I should probably remove myself, but these guys they're wising up now. They realized that these SARMs were suppressing their endogenous testosterone output. So what did they do? They started taking a testosterone base. Correct. So now they're taking a testosterone base with their SARMs. I'm like, what the fuck? It's like, why don't you just use compounds that we have data on?
Correct. And this is what one of the arguments I have about the information that people have is just not factual. So my favorite drug, and I'm not saying it needs to be everyone's favorite drug, it's my favorite drug, is primobolan. And the reason it's my favorite drug is because, in my opinion, it's the gold standard of safer use. You can use primobolan. It's more than strong enough for my needs, and it provides me with very little stress very little oxidative stress, very little kidney, kidney, liver, across the board. Very, very, very low stress. It's not no stress, low stress drug. But this is the thing I was getting to about like the Hirschberg assays. What people don't realize is that they think there was like, they took these drugs and they subjected them to one assay and that was the result they got. That nothing could be further from the truth. If you actually look at these drugs, I mentioned about Trenbolone, there are like a dozen or so of these assays that have been done over the last 10 years. Trenbolone is a fascinating compound because most people will look at Trenbolone and say, look, it has a relatively low anabolic to androgenic ratio, but that's not true because there are some of these assays that said, look, the anabolic to androgenic ratio was about 2 to 1. That sounds terrible. Like you're thinking, man, that's like, why would I use that drug? But some of the assays showed Primobolan as having a androgenic to anabolic ratio of 30 to 1. Now, I'm not saying it's 30 to 1, but I'm saying if it was 30 to 1, what that would mean, it was a ratio that would leave any SARM in the dust. Do you know what I mean? So again, like, it's not like we don't have drugs that offer tissue selectivity. It's not like we don't have drugs that have a fabulous track record dating back 60 years. It's not like we don't have tools that can get the job done for us, because anybody that was to take 300 milligrams of testosterone and 300 or 400 milligrams of Primobolan is going to smoke anybody on a SARM cycle. You just leave them behind, yeah? And I would challenge this, and that is when you go and get your blood work done in 12 weeks, you will be under no more duress than anyone else doing. So if you had the option of saying, okay, so I'm going to take a combination of two compounds that will, without question, outperform any SARMs that we have, I can use these compounds at near clinical dose, because when Primobolan was in clinical use, they used to give 300 milligrams a week to women. Testosterone is routinely given to men at 200 milligrams a day. Put those two drugs together versus someone taking 30 times the recommend, or it's not even a recommended dose, 30 times the dosage we see in the clinical trials. Why would we be interested? Because they're misinformed. And this is my whole, my whole purpose of trying to get this message out there. If it was true, I would be very supportive, but it's just based on miseducation and misinformation provided by the information providers. So here's the thing. When most people think about where do I get my information about SARMs from, unashamedly and unquestionably, it comes from overwhelmingly one place, and that is websites that sell SARMs.
Yeah.
You know? And it shits me because I just go, like, I read these sites and I go, that's just not true. And yet people are using these things as, places of education and places of information when they're nothing more than, in a slick and polished marketing lie. There is absolutely no clinical evidence that the application of SARMs at the dosages used by our tribe represent a better safety profile than low-level testosterone and something like low-level Primobolan. There is no evidence to support that, period.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So I apologize for my passion. Obviously, you guys can tell I'm extremely passionate.
Well, not only is there no evidence, but it's just like, I mean, it's clear, and we can quantify it with looking at people's lab values, for example, right?
Correct.
Just
Correct.
the common stuff, like the common things like lipid profile, and that gets impacted. Like I said, I mean, I've seen people using SARMs and seen typical HDL suppression and all that, all that stuff. Granted, it wasn't as much as someone taking 2 grams of gear, but they're also not getting nearly the effects of someone taking 2 grams of gear. So
correct. But if you think about it, if you look at it and say, okay, so when you take a moderate dose of testosterone, one would expect to see a suppression of, say, HDL cholesterol levels of about 3%. Where do we get that data from? I'm sure you guys are more than familiar with the dose response studies that were done on testosterone a number of years ago, where they look at 150, 300, 600 milligrams of test, over a 20-week time frame. So we know that testosterone has the potential to negatively impact lipids, but 3% is pretty modest. When we look at something like Anavar, it jumps to about 15%. And when we look at something like, RAD40, we don't have any human data studies, but we do have primate studies. And the suppression of HDL cholesterol was something like 60% in those primate studies, right? So, as you go through each marker, you kind of go like, I don't even know why you guys are over there. It's just being misinformed. That's the whole reason you're over there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. It is. That's why. But like you said, one of the problems too is that getting people to believe you. One of the reasons I don't. It's the exact reason I don't even comment in those groups and things, because I would be the 0.05% of people that would be going against what everyone's talking about.
Oh, correct. And this quite bluntly, I mean, I don't want to make this like a whinge about me, but this is quite bluntly where I get frustrated at times that I haven't managed to raise a profile greater than I have today in terms of I talk about these things, and that is because you have to understand that the research chemical industry fucking hate me. The science industry hate me. And the guys that run steroid websites that are saying like this, they don't want my message to go out there because it is effectively saying, that's not true. So it's very difficult to get someone to even say, hey, listen, we'll post your content, we'll host your videos, because all of the channels that really this content should be on, right? Not all of them, but the overwhelming majority are saying, I'm resistant to that message being delivered.
Well, that's almost a discussion in marketing, because there's like, I've talked to some of the coaches starting off that they asked me about building their business and marketing. And then I said, look, I'll give you the 100% honest truth that if you put out good sound information that's based on science, based on your own experience, that isn't sensationalized, all of this and that, it's going to take you a lot longer to build up to build up the following. It's going to take you much, much longer, because unfortunately it's just not sexy, And that's something I can talk about a lot. Yeah. Yeah. But that's definitely a different topic. Joe and I have gone on some mini rants about the whole sensationalizing things and just downright making things up to basically further themselves.
Yeah, so this is really like scratching the surface for you guys listening of the kind of content that Victor puts out, and believe me, it's highly applicable to you guys when you're potentially looking into what drug selections you're going to make. And I know it doesn't seem like it, a lot of young guys listen to this, and I'm not exactly speaking from experience here, I'm only 26, but there will be a time when you are done with bodybuilding and you'll probably look back and be like, what the fuck did I do that for? It would make sense to at least minimize the damage as much as possible now, by following the safer use models, you could use that term that Victor speaks about. So I highly recommend anybody that's heard this podcast to check him out, because as I say, this is definitely scratching the surface of the value that his content provides, for sure.
Yeah. And I think truthfully, most people kind of have a ceiling that they're going to reach, and how quick you reach that, depends on what you do along the way. But I'm sure the people that reach it a little bit slower get to enjoy it a little bit more and probably live a lot longer. And they still, like realistically, you're probably going to get from point A to point B. You can get from point A to point B a little bit quicker, perhaps, but you can also not be able to stay there very long, cause other ill effects down the line, so you're probably going to get to the same ending point regardless. But
So Victor,
how you get there makes the difference.
Yeah. Victor, why don't you tell everyone where they can find you, their website, your website, sorry, how they can sign up to your website, etc.
Thank you, buddy. So the website is victorblackmasterclass.com. And I just explain, I have 2 levels of information. I have information for people that are interested in what I refer to as the supernatural man. So in other words, testosterone replacement therapy, recombinant human growth hormone, metabolic modulators, these types of compounds, even potentially insulin in an anti-aging application. And then I have a hardcore section for guys that are interested in what I would consider to be a little bit higher risk model. And I'm not opposed to higher risk. I just think there is a balance that you can reach where you can say, look, I'm, as you said, you're 26, I'm 53, Joe. I'm sure you could kind of look out and say, look, I would like to be doing this 25 years from now. I don't want to do this for 5 years. I want to do this for 30 years or 40 years. I quite bluntly, at 53, I look out and say, I intend to be doing this for the next 25 or 30 years myself. And so hopefully, logically and rationally, guys can understand it. If that's your goal, if you are looking 30 years out from now and saying, look, I still want to be, kicking ass and taking names 30 years from now, you have to take your foot off the gas a little bit. And I think the best way to take your foot off the gas is to think a little bit more rationally and logically about compound selection, about dosages. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to close off by giving guys a couple of quick recommendations. Is that all right, Joe?
Please do. Please do.
Okay. So the first thing I would suggest guys do is this. Take all of your drugs and try to divide them into 2 piles. So you have a pile that you're going to call basal level PEDs, and they're really drugs we're going to live on for the next 30 years. And then you have another pile that you call situational use PEDs, and they're drugs that we're going to potentially reach into for competition or even using them to break through from plateau. If you do nothing more than that, create 2 piles of drugs, and in pile A, we put the drugs that are approved for human use, that have undergone, toxicity testing, that have good clinical evidence to support their application, and then put all the other interesting stuff in the other pile. I'm not opposed to people having the second pile. What I try to get guys to do is understand that if you want to do this for 30 years, you need to spend most of your time drawing drugs from the daily use pile. And on occasion, as required, when the situation calls for it, by all means, reach in and take a little more, or reach in or take a little higher risk compound out and use it for a little bit and then put it back. And I think if guys do nothing more than that, if that's all you get from this, okay, there's a basal level PED pile, there's a situational use PED pile, and I need to look at all the compounds that I want to use and determine where they live and spend most of my time drawing drugs from the basal PED pile. If you do nothing more than that, I think that's a huge leap forward from the way guys think about it today, which is they come out the gate and the first thing they want is the strongest drug, not necessarily the most clinically efficient and safest drug. So I very much appreciate you guys having me on. I know I talk a lot. I apologize. I'm clearly extremely passionate about this subject, but hopefully I provide at least a little bit of value for guys to think about and maybe take away something from the call.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you very much again, Victor, for coming on. Guys, thank you for listening. Please do check out the sponsors below. Please do check out Victor's links. They're all going to be linked down below, his website, his social media, etc. And we'll see you guys next week. Cheers.